pleasure today it's really a pleasure today to welcome Professor Diane Cook as today's Rochon Distinguished Lecture Series speaker. So Professor Cook is the Regents Professor and Huie-Rogers Chair in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Washington State University. She's the founding director of WSU's Center for Advanced Studies in Adaptive Systems, or CASAS, and co-director of the WSU AI Laboratory. She's a fellow of the IEEE and the National Academy of Inventors. Her work has been featured in a number of mainstream publications, including the BBC, Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, and others. Her research is focused on creating smart environments that automate health monitoring and intervention, evaluated via the CASAS Smart Home and box installed in over 160 sites across 9 countries. So I think this idea of smart environment and health monitoring is close to the heart of many of us here at KITE. So I'm looking forward to hearing her updates in terms of what her current research focus is. I will let her speak about it during her talk. So thank you, Diane.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk to you about our work here in the CASAS lab. And today I'm going to talk about this vision of constructing a human digital twin. We, meaning me and my colleagues and our students and staff, are coming from a background of computer science and machine learning, and we want to use a data-driven approach to build this virtual model of a physical human being. So a digital twin is just that. It is a digital model that virtually represents its physical counterpart. A digital twin bridges the gap between the physical and digital worlds. The virtual representation leverages sensor data to observe a physical object. Then the digital twin can use machine learning algorithms to provide a deeper understanding of the object that it's emulating, understand its current behavior, and predict its future behavior. Digital twins have been a disruptive technology for a while. In fact, 30% of the global top companies use digital twins to optimize their operations, but it has been primarily used in manufacturing. So you can imagine when a company is product testing a new tire, they simulate the performance of the tire and the whole car as it connects with the tire in different weather conditions. They predict the performance, they see how well the simulation aligns with their prediction, and then they make changes in real time to optimize the configuration. Our goal is to build a human digital twin. So the human digital twin is a digital model encapsulating what we know from clinical expertise, what we observe directly with sensor data or from other information sources, and what we infer from machine learning techniques about a physical human. The improved ability to collect massive amounts of sensor data and mine such data lay a foundation to build this digital twin. With the digital twin, we hope to better understand health and all the influences on this health. So this digital twin is going to consist of a set of components and try to understand those components and their predictive relationships between those components. So we can use the digital twin to better understand, for example, the relationship between a person's behavior and health. We can predict their future behavior and future health. And we hope to use this to improve health, care, and delivery. As a scenario, consider how digital twin can be used to care for a fictitious person, Jane. And Jane is an older adult who presents with type 2 diabetes, as well as cognitive decline related to Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. We are interested in these particular conditions as a starting point, because both represent significant health concerns. They're both on the rise due to an aging population, and they actually impact each other. There are known comorbidities and observable impacts between diabetes and cognitive decline. So if we were going to build a digital twin, we would want to consider many sources of information. Sensors, they can passively and continuously collect data on Jane's physical state, if we have some physiological sensors, and behavior patterns. These markers, or some markers, can be extracted from the collected sensors data to assess Jane's health status. But to complete the puzzle, we need a lot more information. This assessment should also include Jane's genetic markers, her social interaction and social support system, her medical history and physiology, and her physical environment. So we want to capture all of this, all the individual components and the relations between them, and store them into this digital model. It is important to consider all of these components. For example, we know that both diabetes and dementia are affected by genetics, demographics, nutrition, exercise, culture, lifestyle, physiology. A lot of studies consider one factor at a time when trying to understand health and perform health assessment, prediction, and form treatment. And I think until now, that's been out of necessity because it's difficult to get all those pieces of a person. So we hope that by using some machine learning techniques, we can form predictive relationships between what we know. We can generalize models between people and help to complete this digital twin. So this digital twin idea is part of a big emphasis in the States on scalable precision medicine, where precision medicine is considering the data that we have from a population as whole, but also the unique attributes of one person at a time to come up with the most effective health assessment and intervention approaches. So the digital twin really falls squarely under this overall mission. We, from a computer science perspective, are looking for ways to make such a digital twin comprehensive, reliable, and individualized. And so throughout this talk, I'm going to give you not one study and not one project, but highlight kind of a sample platter of different projects that we have going on, because I know you as a group already come with significant expertise in clinical practice in computer science and machine learning. So I want to try to touch on ideas that would connect with each of you. And these are projects that we have worked on because we feel that they need to contribute to comprehensive, reliable, and individualized goals for a digital twin. To be comprehensive, for example, we need to sense everything. We need to try to sense all different aspects of a person, their physiology, their behavior, and we need to sense continuously, which has been a concern in looking at many projects so far. Is you see a lot of laboratory constraints on observing behavior and other information. We want to sense everything in the wild, and we want to sense it continuously. And that can allow a physician to do their job much better, because instead of relying on self-report and a 15-minute visit to a doctor's office, they should be given information from the digital twin that presents everything that's known about the person over the last year and beyond. And we want to model everything. So what we do sense, we want to be able to build predictive models of what we sense so that we can predict what we're not able to directly sense. So we want to model a person's activities. We want to model their entire behavior and not just some predefined categories. And ideally, we would model the predictive links between components that influence health. We want the models to be reliable. And so we need to find ways to make them more robust by using the links between people and between different health components to actually boost predictive performance. And we need to be able to scale these models to larger populations using techniques like domain generalization. So if we have a new person for whom we have data, but we don't have any ground truth labels, can we still use the data that we have collected from others in a robust manner to make our assessments and interventions reliable? And then we want these interventions and treatments to be individualized. And to do that, our contribution will make sure that they are adaptive, that they draw from the digital twin, and that they are activity aware in their delivery. So these will describe some of the projects I will touch on, and this is the overall goal, to make our digital twin have these attributes. So I start with the sense everything and model everything. And while our goal is to be able to connect health, behavior, and all these other components, genetics and environment, some of which we have hit on in our lab work, what I'm going to be focusing on primarily in this talk today is health and behavior. But hopefully you'll see how even modeling different components of health and different components of behavior boosts performance of the predictive models. And therefore, if we add even more components, we anticipate that that predictive performance would improve even further. So starting with the sense everything, model everything, we want to sense behavior continuously in the wild. We want to model those behavior patterns so that we can recognize and characterize a person's entire behavior routine. We can forecast when certain behavior patterns are likely to come up. That's useful for intervention and treatment. And we want to be able to even detect transitions between activities, because that's a good time for interacting with people. We want to scale the models through domain adaptation. And then again, ultimately, we want to link health with behavior and other components of our digital twin. So we start with activity learning, and I'm sure this is an area that many of you have worked with. But for us, it's a necessary part of building the digital twin, especially if we want to link health and behavior. And we want to model and recognize all of a person's behavioral routine, not just predefined movement patterns based on scripted activities in the lab. We're not just interested in differentiating sit, stand, walk, climb, lie down. We want to model all behaviors of varying complexity. And activity learning is useful for a digital twin because it gives us a vocabulary to express a person's behavioral routine. And we will use that to extract those behavioral markers as part of the digital twin. So in the wild, we want to be able to recognize different kinds of exercise and medication management. So exercise could be running on a treadmill, or it could be yoga. We want to be able to recognize events that are health critical, such as falls. We want to be able to recognize activities in social environments. We want to be able to recognize relax, which may not be on the radar for a lot of people who are looking at activity learning and recognition. And we want to be able to recognize cooking and those activities of daily living. And these activities really take on different behavioral characteristics for different people in different contexts. So for us, this is an ongoing challenge. And I'm sure that this formalism will be the same for many of you, where when we're trying to perform activity learning, our goal is to be able to collect continuous sensor data as a time series data stream, where our sensor reading, or maybe a collection of readings, if we have multivariate data, is stamped by the corresponding time at which the reading was taken. And we want to be able to map each reading onto a corresponding activity label. So the way we do that is to extract features from a time window, and it could be a window of time that is fixed in size, or it could be dynamic based on the likely activity length. And the extracted features become our data vector for a machine learning algorithm. We're going to map that extracted set of features onto one of a set of possible activity labels. We try to design these methods in a way that's fairly sensor agnostic. And so I'll talk about results for activity recognition from ambient sensors in a smart home and for Smartwatch sensors. But we can, and you can, apply the same techniques to a variety of other data, such as object movement sensors, or RFID sensors, or depth camera sensors. It's really, in all cases, just a stream of readings from which you extract features and map it onto an activity label. So being able to sense and model everything, starting with sensing and modeling activities, faces a few challenges when we do this continuously in the wild. And so I will talk about how we have addressed one of those challenges by reshaping the space in which we're modeling and representing activities. And then I will talk about how we use these same technologies to forecast upcoming activities, and eventually talk about detecting transitions in activities and why that's even important. We have done this activity learning in a couple of different settings. This is just an on-campus smart home testbed. And you can see ambient sensors scattered throughout the home in this apartment, which is on campus. It's a real dense layering of sensors, which are these they look like smoke detectors on the ceilings, but they're passive infrared motion detectors that are coupled with ambient light sensors. And then the cabinets have magnetic door closure sensors that are coupled with ambient temperature sensors. And the visualization on the lower left is lighting up the different regions of the home as the passive infrared motion detector senses movement and will light up cabinet doors and external doors with a green bar as it senses a change in state for the door from open to close or vice versa. And so as Jess is moving through the space, you see the simulation lighting up these areas of the home. And you also see these text messages go by, which are the individual sensor readings that are stamped with the corresponding date and time, a sensor identifier, and then the reading. And in this particular technology, which we've been using for over a decade now, they're just text messages. And we have a Raspberry Pi, just a small form computer that collects all of the readings from the individual sensors sent over a Zigbee network. And it provides the timestamp in order in which the central computer receives the readings. It adds the sensor identifier so we know which sensor generated the reading. And then it'll store it into a password protected relational database. We started out, so this is a little bit of history. We started doing this 15 years ago. And at that time, wireless sensors were not very robust. So we had wires sneaking everywhere and it was really ugly. And trying to come up with ground truth labels for the activities was also very difficult. Over time, we were able to make our models incrementally more robust. We were able to make the technology incrementally more lightweight and pretty, to the point where now we have what's called a CASAS SHIB, or a CASAS Smart Home in a box. So we put all of these sensors and the network components into a box and we ship it to whoever is willing to collect data. And the sensors are labeled with functional areas of the home where they should belong. The person can unpackage it and attach the sensors with command strips so that they can be easily removed later. Start up the software and we are instantly collecting data. And to us, that was important because we wanted to be able to collect data from a diversity of participants. And here in Eastern Washington, we don't have a lot of diversity of people. And so with this smart home in a box, we have been able to ship these kits to 9 countries around the world and start to get more and more diverse data. So that's one information source that will be the foundation for some of these studies I will mention. But of course, smart homes they have their own challenges for sure. Activity recognition performs pretty well, actually, as long as you have one person in the home. But if you have multiple people and, oh my goodness, pets, then it gets really kind of crazy. We have had to look at machine learning approaches just to be able to differentiate pets and to be able to split one sensor stream representing multiple residents, say R residents, into R separate streams, one per resident, in order to make it work. But despite that, activity recognition is pretty straightforward, we have found in the home, but the data is limited to the home. We wanted to be able to look at other solutions that are more portable and ubiquitous. And so, we collect data from smartwatches too. So you see here data that's collected from one person with all of the on-device sensors, the accelerometer and gyroscope and heart rate. But we have found that in order to be able to go beyond recognizing ambulatory movements to the point of being able to recognize those same complex activities that we do in the home, we have to collect location data as well. And so what we're seeing here is just one person's data collected over time for both sensor readings and location values. So the nature of the sensors is different between the home and the watch, but the process of windowing the data, extracting features, and using a machine learning algorithm to recognize it is the same. So, sure, I'll get to this point. So another challenge with being able to perform activity recognition, we want to be able to characterize all of a person's behavioral routine. And if we just recognize predefined activities, then we found that we were labeling about half of the data. We would try to recognize all basic and instrumental activities of daily living, and it was about 12 activities on average, but then we were left with 50% unlabeled data. And these data would take the form of maybe a person's own hobbies that don't fall into basic or instrumental activities of daily living, or transitions between activities, you know, these little niche areas. And even in the American Time Use Survey, you'll see that a person's life is broken up into certain regions, but it still doesn't really account for all the details that are unique to a person. We wanted to be able to recognize and model all of a person's behavioral routine, because eventually we're going to extract markers from those labeled data and use them for health assessment and intervention, and they're part of the digital twin. So we had to find a way to deal with the unlabeled data. This is what art looks like in the past. We would have labeled data for certain categories and then a big chunk of unlabeled data. So that created a significant class imbalance issue, which is a challenge for machine learning. Because what we could do if we didn't have labels for certain data is that we could just, and we did, map them all to a category called other. But the other category was so dominant that the models tended to label too many data instances as other, and that kind of skewed our predictive performance. And this other is a gold mine. You know, if a person practices piano, then it's important to note, have they been practicing piano like normal? Has something changed there? So we want to be able to recognize activities within these dominant classes that hopefully have some of the same characteristics and size as the predefined activities. So our idea was to take any activity class that was dominant in size, because we also found that some areas like work and relax were also really big and amorphous, because a lot of different types of work and a lot of different types of relax went into them, and decompose them into smaller regions of the activity space that we would model along with the predefined classes. So we call this Reshaping the Space because it really wasn't defined just for activity learning. This was an idea we had for all of machine learning, and that was to take training data, and for any class that was too large, we would decompose it into subclasses using a traditional clustering algorithm. We would create new labels for those subclasses. So maybe you'd have work.1 or work.2, or maybe a better label like work.type at the computer. Build classifiers that recognize the predefined activities as well as these subclasses of the other category and the other large predefined categories. And we can now classify new data based on the predefined labels or the cluster label, and use them to label the testing data. And if the application warrants, then the cluster label can be replaced with the label of the parent, like work or other, that originally created it. So it looks something like that. Traditionally, we just map the data onto activity label. With this reshaping idea, we have to first define how big is too big. And so any activity category like other, whose size is greater than 1.5, the mean of the rest, is too big. And we create subcategories, and the number of subcategories is defined such that if the data were distributed uniformly among the subcategories, that the size of the subcategories would be the same as the mean size of the predefined activities. So ideally, we would end up with a uniform distribution across the activity labels. We then map the data onto the original label if it's a category that wasn't decomposed, or onto this new cluster label if it is one that was too big and therefore decomposed. And this is just defining K, the number of clusters, such that the remaining sizes will be uniform. And then to show that this is an idea that for us improves activity recognition, that for the machine learning as a whole can be used for imbalanced classes, what we did was we looked at 12 or 15 total data sets, 12 of them from the UC Irvine repository, and 3 specifically from activity recognition using Smart Home or mobile data. And we just plotted in how many cases did we observe a statistically significant improvement in classification performance, either accuracy or F1 score, using this idea of reshaping the space. So we were looking at data sets that had class imbalance, and you can see resampling really, it did improve some cases, but not statistically. And SMOTE, which is a well-known imbalanced class distribution strategy, did find statistically significant improvement for one data set, but this idea of reshaping helped over both of those. And you don't run into the danger of creating and labeling false new points. So that was necessary for us in order to be able to represent the entire space. We have extracted as many features as we could think of, and at this point they are manually extracted. We have certainly played with deep networks that do auto extraction of features, and at this point they're not performing as well. So that's a work in progress. But with these ambient sensors that are collected in the smart home, we collect a lot of features from each window of data that have to do with the time of day and attributes of the window, but also regions of the home and complexity of the movement within that window that might characterize what type of activity is being observed. And then for the mobile sensors, a lot of statistical information related to any one of the sensor sources like accelerometer, gyroscope, heart rate, but also autocorrelation between those values over time, correlation between multi-sensor or multi-axis variables, and so forth. Now, something that's interesting for us with wearable data, as I mentioned before, location was really important in order to be able to recognize complex activities. Oh, I'm seeing questions that I didn't see before, so I'll pause in a moment. The location data, while we collect raw coordinates of latitude, longitude, altitude, we don't process those for a couple of reasons. The first is privacy issues, and the second is generalizability. It's very difficult to generalize location values over multiple persons. So instead, we extract features that are relevant to the location. So we use an OpenStreetMap library, Nominatum, that maps a specific geolocation onto a location type like home, road, service building. And we also look at person-specific location features, like for this person, where is their center point? And at any given location, where are they relative to their center point? Their frequented locations, just based on number of times and duration of their stay at different locations. So are they at one of those frequented locations and so forth? So we build the model on those types of location features rather than the raw location features. All right, I'm going to look at your questions. When collecting data, how would the smart home differentiate family members and pets? we don't right now differentiate family members from pets. We just split the stream into one per resident, and that could be a pet or a resident. That's a good question. I can theorize because these infrared motion sensors are calibrated for a certain mass of person, and pets tend to be right on the borderline of that mass. So we have had issues in the past of teleporting cats that just drive us crazy, where they'll perform activity in one region of the house and then poof, they disappear and they reappear upstairs. So the pets do have distinctive behaviors, not only in terms of this apparent teleporting, but in terms of their movement patterns. So I theorize that we can actually differentiate human from pet that way, and that we could differentiate a family member whose behavior characteristics we can model from a visitor. So I think we can, but we have not yet done an in-depth study of that. Why did sleep account for only 4% of the data? That is because, unlike wearable sensors, which are sampled at a constant rate, the ambient sensors in a smart home are discrete event sensors. So they only report a reading when there's a change in state. So a motion sensor will report on when it senses movement within its field of view, where before it did not sense movement. And then no new text message is given until it senses that there has been no motion for, in this case, 1¼ seconds. With sleep, there's not a lot of readings because there's not a lot of movement typically. And so it's a little bit different in that respect. Did the plot on slide 15 show F1 on the original labels after merging us to, I might have to come back to that. I'm not sure I understand the question. Slide 14. So if you still have that question at the end, please let me know. So then how do these perform? With homes, like I said, they do pretty well. You know, we've looked at data from 50 homes and we get ground truth labels in the following way. We ask residents to fill out a profile before the data collection begins of, for each activity category that we want to model, where and when do they typically perform it? And then it's hands off for residents. We don't want to ask them questions because we don't want to change the nature of their routine by having them interrupt it to provide these labels. And because we have been working primarily with older adults for whom self-report could yield questionable results. I need to keep track on the time. There, we're doing okay. So we provide this questionnaire results and the raw data and a floor plan to external staff members who just make their best guess. But the criteria is that whatever they decide constitutes a particular activity, like a bed toilet transition, they need to label it consistently. For us, we're not interested so much in determining the precise activity, whether this constitutes a true toilet transition activity or not, as being able to recognize activity categories at all. So maybe bed toilet transition would be better labeled with another name, and that's okay because the machine learning performance will be the same. But we also have multiple staff members, and the annotation agreement is generally around kappa of 0.8 across all these activities. So the F1 score is pretty high for threefold cross-validation, but of course that's a little bit biased because you could be taking data that is close in time for training and for testing. So we also look at leave one home out validation, and that does drop the performance by about 0.1 or a little bit more. And we have done some validations, even in multiple resident homes, where we tell them, we guess in real time from our model what activity they're performing, and then we ask them in real time to label what they're performing, and we see how often they line up, and it's doing pretty well. For the Smartwatch data collection, this needs to be updated because we have actually done this now with 50 subjects. And what we do in this case is we give subjects 2 watches, one to wear during the day while the other one's charging, and then they swap it at night so that we have continual data collection. And we prompt them a few times a day, so there is some interruption in this case to label their current activity. And that's how we get ground truth label. And we have to sacrifice the person's routine in this case because it would be too difficult for an external annotator to tell what they're doing from the sensor data. Excuse me. And again, with threefold cross-validation, it's performed pretty well. And with leave one out, it has dropped. But this is, as we have expanded from 6 subjects and 6 activities to a larger number of subjects, this has actually dropped. So this is an area for ongoing research. We are finding that for many activities like work and like exercise, that they have such different behavior signatures that trying to build a generalizable model from Smartwatch data in contrast with smart home data is really challenging. So one idea we have for ongoing work is to actually build our own vocabulary of activities from the raw data using some text embedding techniques, because what one person calls exercise, another person might call relaxation in the case of yoga. And that is to an extent getting in the way of our being able to consistently label data with activities and then use that as part of our digital twin for health assessment and intervention. So an area of ongoing work. I'm still in the idea of sense everything, model everything. So I think I need to pick up the pace. Once we can sense everything, model everything, and recognize activities in real time, then we can also forecast the activities because we have historic data and we have the corresponding activity labels. So we can use the historic data to say at any point in time, how many time units would elapse until that activity occurred again. And that's kind of useful for us for one possible intervention, since working with older adults who have memory decline. The intervention we started with was prompting them to remember to initiate activities that they may forget. And so we could use this as a way to prompt them when there's a particular time and context where they would perform an activity, but that time has passed and they haven't initiated it. So forecasting activities can be really valuable. And once you can label the data, you can predict them. All right, I see another question. When clustering the other data class, which algorithm did we end up using for creation of subclasses? We just use k-means. So that's a great question. There might be better ways, but for now, that's what we had in place. And for sake of time, I'm going to skip this because you will see this on a later slide. But we can predict activities pretty well. Again, this was based on smart home data. It was more challenging with smartwatch data. With the normalized root mean squared error was better for joint prediction than independent prediction. And I haven't told you what that is yet. So hopefully that will just whet your appetite for what is to come. But the end result is that we were able to predict almost all activities within about 5 to 10 minutes of when they actually did next occur. All right, so sense everything, model everything. We want to, once we have sensed all behavior data and then labeled it with activities, we want to extract behavior markers that we will use as the foundation for this digital twin. And so we have this huge set of markers here, which you can find in a paper, but essentially we're just trying to model things like what is the obviously total amount of movement by day, by hour, overall. For each of these labeled activities, what's the time of day and amount of time and location where they perform these activities? What is the complexity of the behavior? It could be just like the entropy over the locations that they visit. What is the regularity? Because for us, we found that individuals who are starting to go through cognitive change, the structure of their routine started to kind of crumble a little bit. So we're interested in quantifying the regularity of their schedule and similar to that, their circadian rhythm. So all of these markers that we extract from the activity labeled data become part of the digital twin. then when we have these digital behavior markers, we want to link those predictively with health measures. And so in our early attempt to do this, we collected data for multiple years in a smart home. And you can see the process. We collected data, we extracted these behavior markers, and we would have these assessment points every 6 months where our clinical partners would come in and perform a battery of neuropsychological assessment tests. We would have these measures, and then we would see if a machine learning technique could predict those measures and an overall diagnosis using the 6 months of data leading up to the assessment point. So we predicted measures that were both cognitive health related, in this case, RBAMs, and mobility related as well as cognitive health, in this case, the timed up and go tug result. And we had our own new clinical measure, which is very near and dear to my colleague Maureen Schmitter-Edgecombe, where there are measures for activities of daily living, but she found with individuals undergoing cognitive decline that they were really clever at finding compensatory techniques to help them remain functionally independent. So if a person used Post-it notes or technology as a type of cognitive prosthesis, then she came up with this new measure, IADL-C for compensation, to indicate how well they're performing functionally in that context. And for 29 homes, collected data with an average of 2 years, but several of the homes went up to 7 years. So the mean age of the participants when we started was 85. So you can imagine the number one went through cognitive change during data collection. We were able to predict RBANs, TUG, and IADL-C with moderate to large correlation, which was really encouraging to show that there was a predictive link between behavior and cognitive health. More recently, then, I mentioned I would talk about joint and independent inference. We did the same thing, only this time we actually fused both smart home data and Smartwatch data because we wanted to know what the role of each type of information would play in predicting these measures and could they do better together. So we combined smart home and Smartwatch by just extracting the features that I showed you earlier for each and then aggregating them together. We could perform some dimensionality reduction as needed, but we also use this idea called joint inference, which is going to be really important for our digital twin. And that is, we would use information features like a person's demographics and their smart home features, their smart watch features, to predict each one of these clinical measures that I have listed in this table that measure various aspects of cognition, memory performance, and functional independence. But then, so we would predict each one of these measures, and then we would supplement the prediction through a second round of inference in which we use the predicted measures for the other categories, as well as the demographics and the sensor features to perform prediction. So the idea is, in the case of our example patient, Jane, knowing that diabetes and cognitive decline are related, if we are able to predict Jane's cognition level, then that information might help us do a better job of predicting her management of type 2 diabetes and vice versa. So we hypothesize that there are relationships between the components of a digital twin. They can be used to boost predictive performance, and that's going to become the core of our digital twin. And so with independent performance, you can see that we were able to get small to moderate correlation between our predicted values and the true values using the fusion of smart home and Smartwatch data collected for 1 month for our participants. But that in general, the joint inference does improve performance. So it is important to get as much information as you can and find the predictive relationships between these different measures. In that case, we have a much greater range. We only have small correlation in some cases, but large in others. And so we're excited about that and continue to push that. But moving on, as I am running out of time, as I said, we want to sense everything, model everything, link everything in order to be able to perform health assessment, but then scale so that it becomes more reliable. And scale is important because we don't get ground truth data for every point in time, for every person, and so forth. Our idea of scaling is to be able to use labeled data from one person, point in time, health domain, and map it onto another domain, where a domain is a person, a home, a health context, source of data, whatever you need to map between. And so we use, and you have a lot of computer scientists, so you're probably familiar with generative adversarial networks. These GANs have been used a lot to generate synthetic data for image domains. And the idea is you have two learning agents, typically deep networks. One is a generator who's trying to con the other agent by generating synthetic data that hopefully can't be distinguished from real. And the second agent is the detective who is trying to categorize the data as real or fake. They both start out pretty ignorant, and it's important that they learn at the same rate. And so they actually get better at their job by working together adversarially. And that is typically how these GANs are used. We use it slightly differently. We want to learn domain invariant features. If we learn domain invariant features, then we can map our data on our model from one domain, which is one person, one point in time, one home, to another. So the con artist generator is trying to generate domain invariant features, and the detective is trying to determine whether the data are from the original domain or the new one that we're trying to map to. We do this, I'm going to skim over a lot of the detail here. We can do this from one source, like just one previous person, or from multiple sources, multiple previous persons, all of whom have contributed some labels. And obviously it does better with multiple than with one. And we also found that it does better with weak supervision, meaning that we don't actually have labeled activity data in this case for this new domain, but maybe we have proportions. We know the proportion of time that a person spends on walk, eat, sleep, cook. And in particular, if the proportions are different between the source and the new target domain, that information actually will boost performance. So this is some of the architecture specific information that I'm going to skim past for sake of time. And here's how we incorporate the weak supervision into our loss function. But the end result is that the idea of weakly supervised domain adaptation does outperform no adaptation, which is the green bar, and even previous methods which aren't really suited for time series. So this gives us an indication, and these are publicly available activity recognition data sets, that we can perform this domain adaptation, but it is an ongoing challenge. And while GANs are not new, and GANs for domain adaptation have been looked at a little bit, GANs for domain adaptation of time series data, that's really challenging, and that's a new niche. And so we have gained some traction here on these 4 data sets, but we really want to push it further. We want to be able to do this for between sensor modalities and information sources, for example. And so you can see all these methods improve as you throw more source domains at it. But this will be necessary in order to scale our models up to more types of target variables and more people. Okay, now we're going to go on a lightning fast tour through some of the other health applications that we have been looking at that build on this digital twin technology. One is not only to link behavior with prediction of clinical measures, but to actually use the data to detect health events. And this individual is participating in our studies, and he asked us to share this picture because he has Parkinson's and he has Rochon's disease. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly, where he has a constant state of thirst. And so he tends to get up in the middle of the night a lot in order to get a drink of water or use the restroom, and he falls a lot in the middle of the night. And so we want to introduce new techniques for detecting change in these behavior markers that are either gradual, that allow us to predict changes in clinical measure, or sudden, that allow us to predict sudden events like the fall. And so what we do is from these same behavior markers, we extract markers at different points in time. And then we have introduced statistical methods. I see your question, I'll come to it. Statistical methods for quantifying the changes in the behavior markers and determining if the change is statistically significant. Okay, is it possible to track both positive, negative, and indifferent independence toward joint inferences simultaneously? Well, in a sense, that's what we're doing, because we're not necessarily looking, I'm not sure if I understand your question, but we're not necessarily looking for positive, negative, or non-correlation. We're just trying to determine if there's a predictive relationship. And so it can be any one of the above. We're not distinguishing between them. And that might be an interesting question. What is the window scale that would safely satisfy each and all? Yeah, window scale, good question. I think we usually ideally let the task drive the selection of the window scale, because there's no magic number that is going to work for all predictive tasks. In practice, I get asked a lot, how much data do you need in order to be able to predict a person's activity? And we have found in both Smartwatch and home data that 2 weeks has established a baseline for the activities that we model, because these are activities that tend to occur on an almost daily basis. So the change detection, we tried this out for some of the individuals living in these smart homes that had known health events, and found that it could. Now, we haven't tried all possible health events. There's so much horizon there yet to tap. These ones clearly had a behavioral impact. For example, this one was one of our participants who was diagnosed with lung cancer and then started treatment. And interestingly, the participant said they didn't really feel differently when they had a diagnosis, but we see this blip above the red significance line in the week that they received the diagnosis. So there was some impact. And then there was even more impact, interestingly, right prior to, as well as throughout the treatment. And then if we build a heat map of the activities, darker color means more time was spent on that activity during that time. We see that sleep patterns change. This person slept less at night and more during the day when they were going through treatment. And there was a lot more in our home, which in talking with the participant would maybe have been due to visitors coming. And that is perhaps what drove the change even before treatment started. So we were able to use this to detect the cancer treatment. We were able to detect urinary tract infections and falls. But again, there's so many others out there with different windows of time and types of changes in behavior markers that this is just a start. I'm going to skip the robot intervention. That's probably the farthest one out there. But and with looking at this digital memory notebook, I did mention that we not only model activities and forecast when they're going to occur, but we also detect changes in activities or activity transitions. Similar to detecting these behavior changes in the previous slide, we statistically look at when the feature values undergo a dramatic change between 2 points in time. And this is important for us in providing those activity-aware, personalized interventions, because we find that if we interrupt people to remind them to start an activity or to answer a question, they get annoyed, they don't respond, they don't adhere to the treatment. And for individuals undergoing cognitive decline, interrupting their current activity could cause confusion and put the success of their current activity in danger. So we have also used these change detection techniques to detect changes in the sensor, raw sensor data itself that we label as activity transitions, and we deliver our questions and interventions at that time. This is just a description of how we detect those changes. But we see that the detection delay is typically less than 2 minutes for an activity transition. And the corresponding activity recognition accuracy increases because we can actually segment the data now. This is the begin and end of each activity. And we have improved our response rate to over 80% when we ask people EMA questions or ask them about their current activity or ask them to initiate an activity over just fixed time or random time prompts. That was the high level summary of that. So this last thing, our digital memory notebook, which is interesting for us because this gives us a way to intervene, but it also gives us, interestingly, a way to improve assessment. So this digital memory notebook is really the brainchild of Maureen Schmitter-Edgecombe, who's been working with paper and pen notebooks for decades as a way to help people with cognitive decline to make contacts and appointments and to journal so they remember what went on that day, the last time they spent time with a friend, to remember what went on. And we just created a digital version of it on an iPad. And we used multiple rounds of participatory design to make sure that it could be usable with older adults. So that meant large fonts, bright contrasting colors, and a lot of obvious symbols. And then we enhanced it yet again to partner this with a smart home so that the smart home would actually detect when they performed activities and remind them and prompt them. This is where all that intervention led up to perform an activity they haven't yet started. So I'm going to close with just a demo of how this works. I'm going to probably mute the sound and just go quickly through it. And then how we're using this to improve assessment. And then I'll open this up for questions.
So this is the digital memory notebook.
See if I can mute
it's
this.
a task management app, and so what you do is you can schedule different tasks you have throughout the day.
I'm fast forwarding through it. So the digital memory notebook partners with the smart home. The smart home detects, for example, that Jess took her medicine, but she's supposed to take her medicine with food, and so that's a context that model has learned in which she eats, but this time she has forgotten to eat. So she's getting a prompt to look at the notebook. The notebook is reminding her that she needs to eat. She will eat an apple, fast forwarding. And then the notebook will show that not only did it detect that she took medicine, but it detected that she ate. There's the take medicine, and there's the eat. So I'm sorry for going lightning fast through that. The reason that we're still talking about it is that this is an intervention that is being used in people's homes now, particularly veterans with cognitive decline. We're deploying it in 40 different homes. And it's really neat, as you guys must know, to come up with this intervention that has an impact, because since this is just researchers that put it together, ultimately the app experienced problems and it crashed. And these participants wanted to drive with the notebook multiple hours to our campus and have us fix it on the spot because they really didn't want to be separated from it. And that lets us know how important it is to design robust technology that's going to be used. Very recently, I just put this table on the slides this morning, and it hasn't been published yet. We not only use the memory notebook for intervention, but we've used it to further link our digital twin and improve health assessment. We have included not only the smart home features, but we also include the usage information, how regularly somebody is using the notebook. And in the notebook, we let them journal. And so we extract sentiment features and other text features, which can be indicative of cognitive health. And we combine all of those markers to perform cognitive assessment. And then we perform independent or joint assessment and see that the markers that performed best predictively does vary. Sometimes it's the usage of the memory notebook. Sometimes it is, I don't remember what task it's, sorry. Sometimes it is the text entry in the notebook, and sometimes it is the smart home features. So this is still work that's ongoing, but we see how important it is to link all of a person's different components to do a better job of health assessment and intervention. So I mentioned a lot of areas that we're continuing to look at. We want to scale the behaviorome better to adapt to new modalities and information sources. The wearable activity recognition is still a challenge, and we want to connect more influences for health and behavior, genetics, environment. And ultimately, we have to build models that are interpretable for clinicians to rely on and use. So I know you're doing a lot of work in these and other areas. Hopefully we'll find some room for collaboration. That is the end. So I will open this up for questions.
Much, Dr. Cook. That was wonderful. Thanks for taking some questions as you went along. That's great. We're a bit over time. We have time for a couple more questions from the audience. I'll start things off. Can you give us your perspective on, so based on all your experience with smart home sensor packages, on what is there a minimal set? Like, is there a subset of sensors? What is do you need everything, or can you make do with a reduced set and get substantially similar information?
Well, that's a very good question, and it does depend on what you mean by make do. So we have had some papers that show the predictive performance of different activities from different sensor suites. If we're trying to look at these basic and instrumental activities of daily living, we have found that smart home sensors do the job very well. And that's definitely a minimal sensor set, right? We're looking at coarse granularity motion sensors and door open closure sensors. So that has been enough. But with every sensor we add, we get finer granularity detail.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. What has been your experience with sensor malfunction?
What has been our experience with sensor malfunction? It's different in the smart home and with the smartwatch. The smartwatch location sensors are highly variable. So we get a lot of wild readings that we have to filter out and clean the data. But we use Apple Watches, and Apple gets increasingly robust at handling like drift in the data and gravitational influences. So the sensor data get better. The location values are not always very robust. In the home, we have rarely had sensor malfunction, but we do get misinterpretation of the data. You have to really understand how the sensor works. With an infrared motion sensor, it's detecting heat. And so it'll detect heat due to baseboard heaters. We were wondering why somebody kept coming down the stairs in the middle of the night, because we would get a lot of activity at 2 in the morning. And that was because the baseboard heaters were kicking on. And we would get some readings due to laser printers. So it is good to be able to understand the nature of the data so that we can interpret it correspondingly. Door sensors, oh my goodness, when you put them on windows, if it's not a tight fit, magnetic door sensors are a pain, and we want a better solution because one half of the magnet is on the frame, one half is on the door, and they have to be perfectly aligned so they can tell when the door's open because they're no longer aligned. But if there's wind that might cause it to jiggle, then all bets are off. Let's see. Given that many sensors need to operate over a long period of time. Oh, that's part of the previous question. Yeah.
There's a new question as well in the chat on the Q&A. Can you discuss your experience with IRB and concerns around privacy, security, risk, and safety when collecting human data from the home?
Oh, okay. So I'm not sure I heard what you were just saying, Jose. Is there an IRB risk? Is that the question regarding collecting these data?
I'm just reading the question. It's a question. Can you discuss your experience with IRB and concerns around privacy, security, risk, and safety when collecting human data from the home? I guess in terms of data sharing and data privacy.
Yeah. I think with smart home data, it has been pretty straightforward. It would be very difficult to be able to re-identify a person with just smart home data and activity labels. We had one instance where we were able to localize somebody because there was a solar eclipse. And so we could actually tell the dip in their infrared motion sensors. And so one of my students who liked to look at that was able to figure out at least the approximate area where this participant lived. But other than that, it's pretty minimal risk. But the wearable is a different story, particularly when we get to location sensors, which is why we do not use raw location values in our models. We use location relative features. But even having said that, and we write our own data collection apps, so we're not going through a third party. But anytime you turn on location services, Apple in this case has access to the data. So we have to report that, and that is an ongoing problem that we do not yet know a way around.
Thank you. One last question, then I think we'll close. What are your thoughts towards enabling access to this technology? What about equitable access for people who have less interest or education about tech monitoring, people with lower socioeconomic means, etc.?
You know, we just trying to get some funding, and hopefully it will come through. I was talking to Jose and Milos early on about how we wanted to get a lot of data, because when we collect data around here, this is Eastern Washington, it's near Idaho. We don't get a lot of diversity of people. And in this, we're hoping to collect data from a lot of socioeconomic, demographic groups in order to be able to capture that diversity of data. We are starting to look at ways of detecting bias in the models and using synthetic data generation to hopefully increase diversity and reduce the model bias. So we feel strongly that we want to enable access to the technology. All of these data collection apps, by the way, the apps are available online. We can give you links to it, but still having access to the sensors and their costs is a prohibitive factor. But if these grants are funded, then we will have a great deal of money to just ship these watches out and get a lot of data from, in particular, underrepresented groups. And hopefully we would get to work with some of you in that context, because we can all use this data.
Thank you. So I'd like everybody to join me again for the wonderful day, and thanking you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you. That's great.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.